The judge's laughter echoed through the silent courtroom, a sharp, cruel sound that cut deeper than any legal jargon. He looked down at me from his towering bench, his eyes filled with disdain for the teenager standing in a borrowed suit. To him, I was a joke, the final, pathetic act in my family's losing battle against our HOA. They had bled us dry with fines, harassed us into submission, and now they were here to take our home. This judge was their final hammer blow. He thought he held all the power, but he failed to see what was hidden in plain sight. How could he know that the person he was about to dismiss was the only one who had read every line of every law, just waiting for this one perfect moment? For my family, the house on Maple Drive wasn't just wood and drywall, it was the finish line of a marathon we'd been running our whole lives. My parents had worked double shifts, saved every spare dollar, and poured all their dreams into this one, single-story home in a neighborhood that looked like it was pulled from a postcard. I remember the first day, the scent of fresh paint mixing with the smell of newly cut grass. My dad, a carpenter by trade, immediately claimed the garage as his sanctuary, his eyes gleaming with plans for a workshop where he could finally build furniture for us, not just for clients. My mom started planning her garden that very afternoon, sketching out beds of vibrant, colorful flowers that would defy the neighborhood's endless sea of monotonous green lawns. For the first few months, life was exactly as we had imagined. It was peaceful. We were a quiet family, content with weekend barbecues and the simple joy of having a place that was truly ours. I'd spend my afternoons reading on the porch, watching the rhythm of the community. It was a rhythm governed by an unseen but ever-present force, the Homeowners Association. The welcome packet had included a binder, thick as a dictionary, filled with rules and regulations. My parents had laughed it off, placing it on a high shelf to collect dust. To them, it was just a formality. The rules seemed absurd, almost comical: specifications on the exact shade of beige for a mailbox, the maximum allowable height for blades of grass. We were good neighbors, we kept to ourselves, and we took pride in our home. What could possibly go wrong? The first sign of trouble arrived in a crisp, white envelope. It was a notice, cold and impersonal, stating that my dad's garage workshop was a violation. The HOA bylaws, it cited, prohibited any form of commercial enterprise on residential property. He wasn't running a business, he was just a man who loved to work with wood, filling our home with hand-carved shelves and tables. The notice felt like a slap in the face. My mom tried to smooth things over. She went to the next HOA meeting, a friendly smile on her face, ready to explain the misunderstanding. That's when we first met the HOA president, a woman whose perfectly ironed clothes and tight-lipped expression seemed to radiate a chilling sense of authority. She listened to my mom's explanation with a blank stare and simply stated that rules are rules. That first notice was just a crack in the dam. Soon, the flood began. Another envelope appeared, this time complaining about my mom's garden. Her beautiful, exotic flowers were not on the pre-approved list of community-appropriate flora. They were too bright, too different. A fine was attached. Then came a violation for our welcome mat, which was deemed overly expressive. A fine was attached. Each week brought a new complaint, a new demand, a new penalty. The thick binder came down from the shelf, its pages now filled with highlighted sections and desperate notes scrawled in the margins by my parents. The joy began to drain from our home, replaced by a constant, simmering anxiety. My dad stopped spending time in his workshop, the silence from the garage was deafening. My mom's garden, once her source of pride, became a source of stress as she watched the HOA president patrol the sidewalk, clipboard in hand. I watched the light dim in my parents' eyes. They felt trapped, suffocated by an enemy they couldn't reason with. They were being crushed by 1,000 tiny, paper-cut rules, and the legal fees to fight back were more than they could ever afford. It was during one of those late nights, when I could hear their worried whispers through my bedroom wall, that I pulled out the HOA binder myself. I wasn't just a kid watching his family suffer anymore. I was looking for a weapon. And as I read through the dense, convoluted language, a slow, burning anger began to build inside me. They thought they were dealing with a simple carpenter and a gardener. They had no idea their meticulously crafted rules were about to be turned against them. My nights changed after that. While my parents slept, or tried to, I was awake, the glow of my laptop screen painting my room in a pale, sterile light. The HOA binder was my textbook, and the internet was my library. I wasn't just a kid anymore, I was a researcher, a detective hunting for a weakness in an enemy that seemed invincible. I devoured articles on property law, scrolled through forums where other homeowners shared their own HOA horror stories, and learned a new language, the cold, precise language of bylaws and statutes. It was in the deep hours of the night that I found the first crack in their armor, a tiny clause in our state's property code that dictated the exact time frame and method for notifying a homeowner of a violation. Our HOA, in its arrogant haste, had gotten it wrong. They were off by 48 hours. It was a technicality, a bureaucratic slip-up, but to me, it was a foothold. Armed with this small piece of leverage, I helped my parents draft a formal appeal. My dad, a man who spoke with his hands and the grain of wood, struggled with the words, so I wrote them for him. The letter was polite, emotionless, and surgically precise. It didn't plead for mercy, it simply stated the facts and quoted the HOA's own bylaws back at them, pointing out their procedural error. We sent it off, a flicker of hope warming the cold anxiety in our house. The HOA's response was not a letter, but an act of public humiliation. At the next quarterly community meeting, the HOA president stood before our neighbors and held up a piece of paper. She didn't use our names, but everyone knew who she was talking about. She read a list of our infractions, from the unapproved flora to the potential commercial enterprise, painting us as rogue residents who threatened the neighborhood's pristine image and property values. My parents, who had attended in hopes of a peaceful resolution, sat in stunned silence as the eyes of our neighbors turned on us, filled with judgment and suspicion. We were no longer just a family in a dispute, we were outcasts. Days later, a letter arrived. Our appeal was denied. Attached was a new, consolidated fine, larger than all the previous ones combined, with a chilling addition, a formal warning that a lien would be placed on our home if the full amount wasn't paid in 30 days. The ground beneath our feet had just given way. The word lien hung in the air in our house like a toxic gas. It was no longer about a garden or a workshop, it was about the very real possibility of losing everything. My mom started looking at real estate listings in other towns, her face a mask of quiet defeat. My dad retreated into a deep, frustrated silence. Seeing them so broken ignited a fire in me that burned away any remaining fear. I couldn't let them surrender. That evening, I laid out my findings on the kitchen table, printouts of the state code, the HOA's own contradictory rules, a timeline of their flawed notification process. I explained that their case against us wasn't built on solid rock, but on sand. For the first time in months, I saw a spark of defiance return to my father's eyes. He wasn't going to run from a bully. On my guidance, we bypassed the HOA's internal kangaroo court. We spent money we didn't have to consult with a lawyer for 1 hour, who confirmed my findings and helped us draft a single, powerful document. It was a formal cease and desist letter, sent via certified mail, addressed to each member of the HOA board. It outlined their procedural breaches in excruciating detail and demanded the immediate removal of all fines and the threat of the lien. This was a move they never saw coming. They were used to shouting matches and emotional pleas, not calculated, legally backed challenges. The HOA president, cornered and enraged, took it as a personal declaration of war. She couldn't fight us on the legal points, so she made it personal. Her car started making slow passes by our house multiple times a day. We'd see the flash of a camera from her window as she documented every perceived flaw, a single weed near the sidewalk, a garbage can left out an hour too long. Then, she escalated. She filed an anonymous complaint with the city's code enforcement department, weaving a wild story about my dad running an unlicensed industrial business from his garage, complete with hazardous chemicals and dangerous machinery. One Tuesday afternoon, the doorbell rang. Standing on our porch was a stern-faced city official, holding a clipboard and a court-ordered warrant to inspect our property. The war had just breached our front door. The inspection was one of the most humiliating experiences of our lives. The inspector, acting on the malicious tip, treated my dad like a criminal in his own home. He went through the garage with a fine-toothed comb, swabbing for chemical residues, measuring noise levels, and scrutinizing every tool. My dad, a proud craftsman whose workshop was his sanctuary, had to stand by and watch as his private space was torn apart, his integrity questioned. Of course, the inspector found nothing. The complaint was baseless, and he left with a grumbled apology. But the damage was done. The violation notice he left, for a minor electrical outlet that wasn't up to a newly revised code, felt like a final twist of the knife. It was a legitimate, albeit tiny, infraction he was obligated to report, and the HOA immediately seized upon it as proof of our negligence. While my parents reeled from the invasion, I channeled my rage back into my research. This was bigger than just our family now. I started investigating the HOA president herself. I spent countless hours digging through public county records, cross-referencing business licenses, and reading the minutes from years of HOA meetings. And then I found it. A thread. The HOA's landscaping contract, worth tens of thousands of dollars a year, was held by a company called Evergreen Solutions. A little more digging revealed that the owner of Evergreen Solutions was the HOA president's brother-in-law. The contract had been awarded without a competitive bidding process, a clear violation of the HOA's own financial policies. But there was more. I created a map of the neighborhood and marked every home that had been fined in the last 2 years against those that hadn't. The pattern was undeniable. Friends of the board, including 2 board members with clear, visible violations, unapproved sheds and fences, had never received so much as a warning letter. It was a system of cronyism and selective, vindictive enforcement. I now had proof of corruption. I was still figuring out how to deploy this explosive information when the HOA made their final, devastating move. A courier delivered a thick, intimidating envelope to our door. Inside, wrapped in legal jargon, was a document that made my mother gasp and my father's face turn pale. The HOA's law firm was officially suing us. They were moving to foreclose on the lien against our property to collect the now astronomical sum of fines and their own legal fees. A court date was set. This was it. The point of no return. My parents sat at the kitchen table that night under the weight of a silence so heavy it felt like a physical object. The foreclosure notice lay between them like a tombstone for their dreams. They couldn't afford a lawyer to go up against a corporate firm. They were ready to give up everything. It was in that moment of absolute despair that I walked into the room, my heart pounding in my chest. I placed 3 binders, neatly organized and filled with everything I had found, on the table in front of them. They looked up at me, their eyes hollow with defeat. And I told them we weren't hiring an attorney. Because, as far as the court was concerned, I was going to be their legal representative. The walk into the courthouse felt like a march toward a cliff's edge. The marble floors and towering columns were designed to make you feel small, and on that day, they succeeded. My parents were ghosts of themselves, their faces pale with a terror I could feel radiating from them. On the other side of the grand hall, we saw them. The HOA president stood with her lawyer, a man who looked like he was carved from arrogance and expensive fabric. He gave us a dismissive glance, a predatory smirk that said our fate was already sealed. He saw my parents as a paycheck and me as an irrelevant footnote. As we took our seats on the hard wooden bench of the courtroom, my mom reached for my hand, her own trembling like a leaf in a storm. I gave her a firm squeeze, a silent promise that I wouldn't let her down, even as my own heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. When the judge entered, a heavy silence fell over the room. He was an older man with a weary, impatient face, a man who had clearly seen it all and was impressed by none of it. The HOA's lawyer went first, his voice smooth and confident. He painted a picture of my family as a blight on the community, serial rule breakers who flagrantly ignored the reasonable standards of their neighborhood. He listed our supposed violations with dramatic flair, making a welcome mat sound like an act of rebellion and my dad's hobby workshop sound like a public menace. It was a masterful performance of half-truths and exaggerations. Then, he sat down, and the judge turned his tired eyes to our table. "And what does the defense have to say?" he sighed, his tone dripping with boredom. I stood up, my worn suit feeling 2 sizes too big. This was the moment from the hook, the moment I had replayed in my mind 1,000 times. The judge peered at me over the top of his reading glasses, a look of genuine disbelief on his face. "Son, is this some kind of school project? Are you lost?" he asked, not unkindly, but with a deep, dismissive condescension that filled the room. The HOA lawyer let out a sharp, appreciative snicker. The HOA president's smirk widened. In that instant, I felt the full weight of their contempt. They didn't see a defender, they saw a child playing dress-up. I could feel my parents shrink beside me, the humiliation washing over them. But instead of anger, a strange calm settled over me. They had underestimated me. That was the one weapon they had given me for free, and I was about to use it. I took a deep breath, placed my hands on the table in front of me, and looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor," I began, my voice steady and clear, cutting through the lingering amusement in the air. "My name is Leo, and I am here today as the designated representative for my family. We are not here to argue that HOA rules shouldn't exist. We are here to present evidence of a consistent pattern of procedural failures, discriminatory enforcement, and financial malfeasance by the board, which renders their entire action against my family invalid and brought in bad faith." The legalistic terms, spoken with quiet confidence, changed the entire atmosphere of the room. The HOA lawyer's smile faltered. The judge sat up a little straighter, his bored expression replaced with a flicker of intense curiosity. "Proceed," he said, his voice now devoid of any mockery. I opened my first binder, its plastic cover making a sharp, definitive crack in the silence. "Exhibit A, Your Honor," I announced, placing a packet of documents on the bailiff's desk to be passed to the judge. "This exhibit demonstrates that the HOA failed to adhere to the notification requirements outlined in both their own bylaws and Section 720.305 of the state statutes." I walked him through it, step by step. I showed the dates on the initial, non-certified letters. I presented the postal tracking for the certified letters they sent later, proving they were delivered outside the legally mandated window. It was dry, it was technical, and it was irrefutable. The HOA's lawyer shot to his feet, objecting that these were minor clerical errors. The judge silenced him with a wave of his hand. "They are not minor, counsel. They are the entire foundation of due process. Your client's case is showing cracks before it has even begun." I moved to my second binder. Exhibit B details a pattern of selective and discriminatory enforcement. I produced an oversized, color-coded map of our neighborhood. Each house was marked. Red for a home that had been fined, green for a home that had not. Then I presented the photographs. Dozens of them, all time-stamped. Photos of the HOA treasurer's unapproved fence. Photos of the secretary's bright pink flamingos, a direct violation of the garden decor statute. And finally, a clear photo of the HOA president's own property, featuring an enormous, non-compliant storage shed that was partially hidden behind a row of trees. I then presented the HOA's own records, showing that in 2 years, not a single notice or fine had ever been sent to any of these properties. The silence in the courtroom was now heavy and suffocating. The smug confidence had completely evaporated from the HOA president's face, replaced by a ghastly, pale shock. She was squirming in her chair, avoiding the judge's gaze. "And finally, Your Honor," I said, my voice ringing with a strength I didn't know I possessed, Exhibit C. I opened the third and final binder. This exhibit pertains to financial conflicts of interest and the misappropriation of homeowner funds. I presented the HOA's landscaping contract, a staggering sum paid annually to a company called Evergreen Solutions. I presented the state business filings for that company, showing the name of its sole proprietor. And then, I presented a copy of the HOA president's marriage license. The judge looked at the documents, his eyes moving back and forth. The name of the company owner and the maiden name of the HOA president's sister were a perfect match. It was her brother-in-law's company. I wasn't finished. I showed the invoices, which were nearly double the market rate, substantiated by written quotes from 3 other local firms for the exact same services. A collective gasp went through the small public gallery. The HOA president looked like she had been physically struck. Her lawyer was white as a sheet, whispering frantically at her, but she wasn't listening. She was staring at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of hatred and utter disbelief. The judge slowly removed his glasses. He cleaned them, deliberately, before putting them back on. He didn't look at me, or the binders, or the lawyer. He stared directly at the HOA president, and the scorn he had shown me an hour ago was a focused, glacial rage directed entirely at her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You have used your position of petty power to harass and intimidate a family. You have weaponized community bylaws to settle a personal vendetta. And it appears you have done so while defrauding the very neighbors you swore to represent." He picked up his gavel, not with a weary sigh, but with a sharp, decisive motion. He slammed it down once. The sound cracked through the courtroom like a gunshot. "The case against this family is dismissed, with extreme prejudice. All fines are nullified, and the lien is voided." He wasn't done. He pointed a finger at the HOA's lawyer. "Counsel, I suggest you advise your client that my clerk is, as we speak, forwarding all of this evidence to the district attorney's office with my strongest recommendation for a criminal investigation into fraud and embezzlement." The HOA president made a small, choking sound. The judge turned his attention one last time, not to her, but to me. The anger on his face softened, replaced by a look of profound, bewildered respect. My parents were openly weeping beside me, their arms wrapped around each other in a desperate, joyous embrace. I slowly closed my final binder, the quiet click of the rings echoing the finality of the moment. The power hadn't just shifted. It had been completely and utterly dismantled. Walking out of that courthouse was like stepping from a dark, suffocating cave into the bright, clean air of a world reborn. The crushing weight that had been pressing down on my family for over a year simply vanished, replaced by a light, almost dizzying sense of disbelief. My parents walked beside me, no longer hunched over with worry, but standing tall, their hands locked together. As we passed through the grand marble hall, we saw her, the now former HOA president, being quietly spoken to by a court bailiff, her face a mask of crumbling concrete. Her lawyer was gone. Her power was gone. She was just a small, defeated person about to face the consequences of her own cruelty. There was no joy in seeing her misery, only a profound sense of relief, the feeling of a long and terrible storm finally breaking. The car ride home was almost completely silent, but it was a comfortable, healing silence. It was the silence of people who had been to the edge of a cliff and back, who had said everything that needed to be said through shared fear and, now, shared victory. My dad kept looking at me in the rearview mirror, not with the worried eyes of a father, but with a look of awe and a pride so immense it felt like a physical presence in the car. My mom just quietly wiped tears from her eyes, but for the first time in a very long time, they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. When we turned onto our street, it looked different. The trees seemed brighter, the homes less uniform. It was no longer a battlefield, it was just a neighborhood again. Our home, the one that had been turned into a prison of rules and anxiety, now looked like what it was always meant to be, a sanctuary. The first thing my dad did when we got inside was walk straight to his garage. He opened the big door, letting the afternoon sunlight flood the space. He picked up a half-finished piece of oak, blew the dust off it, and switched on his orbital sander. The loud, buzzing hum filled the air, and my mom and I just stood at the doorway and smiled. That sound, which had once been the source of so much trouble, was now the sound of freedom. It was the sound of a man reclaiming his passion. Later that evening, I watched my mom walk through her garden, gently touching the petals of her unapproved flowers. They had survived, just like us. The war was over. We had won. News travels fast in a suburban neighborhood, but news of a court-ordered criminal investigation travels at the speed of light. The story of what happened in that courtroom ripped through our community, and the fallout was immediate and spectacular. The HOA president became a pariah overnight. Neighbors who had once feared her now openly glared as she got her mail. People we had never even spoken to dropped off notes of support on our doorstep, many of them detailing their own years of silent suffering under her reign. My evidence in court had been the crack in the dam, and now the flood of community anger was washing away the entire rotten structure she had built. An emergency HOA meeting was called a week later. It wasn't in the sterile community clubhouse but in the high school auditorium, the only place big enough to hold the sheer number of residents who showed up. It was a revolution in miniature. One by one, homeowners stood up and spoke, their voices shaking with years of pent-up frustration, detailing the petty fines, the harassment, the abuse of power. The president and her cronies on the board sat at a table at the front, shrinking under the barrage of accusations. Before a vote of no confidence could even be called, they all resigned, a stunning and complete capitulation. A temporary board was elected on the spot, filled with decent, reasonable people who promised transparency and fairness. Their first act was to commission a full, independent forensic audit of the HOA's finances. The audit uncovered everything I had suspected and more. It was a cesspool of cronyism, embezzlement, and cooked books. The DA's office moved swiftly. The ex-president was formally charged. Faced with a mountain of irrefutable evidence, our evidence, she pleaded guilty to felony fraud and was sentenced to probation, community service, and, most satisfyingly, full financial restitution to the homeowners she had stolen from. The court ordered the sale of her assets to pay it back, and within 6 months, a "for sale" sign was staked into her perfectly manicured, community-approved lawn. Her departure was the final, symbolic cleansing of the neighborhood. A year later, life on Maple Drive is unrecognizable. The new HOA board dissolved nearly half of the old, ridiculous rules. The neighborhood is more vibrant, more colorful, more alive. My dad's workshop is filled with sawdust and beautiful, handmade furniture that now decorates our home. My mom's garden is a glorious riot of every color and species imaginable, a testament to her defiant spirit. Our house is no longer just a structure, it's a home filled with peace, a symbol of our resilience. As for me, the story of the kid in the borrowed suit became something of a local legend. The judge, in a gesture that still stuns me, sent a personal letter to the dean of admissions at my first-choice university, along with a powerful letter of recommendation. That day in court changed the course of my life. I had gone in as a desperate son trying to save his family's home, and I had walked out with a purpose. I found a passion not for the cold letter of the law, but for the justice it could provide. My path is clear now. My goal is to become the kind of lawyer my parents needed but never thought they could have, a voice for the voiceless, a defender for those who feel powerless against a system designed to crush them. Our story is a testament to the fact that no injustice is too small to fight. It shows that tyranny isn't just something that happens in history books, it can take root in the soil of a quiet suburban street, watered by apathy and fear. But it also shows that it only takes one person, one family, armed with the truth and the courage to speak it, to tear that tyranny out by its roots. It proves that knowledge is power, and when it is wielded in the name of justice, it can be the most potent weapon of all. So, the question is, what silent battle are you fighting, and what would happen if you decided you've had enough?